Okay. I apologize, but it sounds like people can hear me now. Yes, you can hear? Okay, great. I apologize. So I wanted to talk, I guess, again, I want to wish everybody a wonderful post-holiday season. And we talked not just about holidays, but about Shabbat. Today I want to talk about Shabbat. You know, we have that every week, whether you like it or not, it's coming. And so, wanted to talk about Shabbat and use the model that we used a couple of times, which I think was helpful in terms of visualizing something, is not just talking about the halacha, but learning about the teacher, learning about the speaker, and specifically, I would say, through the lens of the history of a particular family, which we'll talk a little bit about, that I think has actually some really interesting implications to the topic. Once you understand about the person who spoke about it, you understand the topic a little bit more, and hopefully leads to what we call that inspiration through halacha. So I want to start with Shabbat, specifically Shabbat candles. And again, hopefully people can still hear me. Shabbat candles are really interesting in that they have transcended the concept of a mitzvah. It's not just a practice or a law or a detail or a minhag that people do. Again, it's more than a minhag. But it has transcended that to be really part of people's Jewish identity. And again, we talked about how, you know, in Chabad communities, you see very, very often that like they really have a big focus on lighting Shabbos candles. And you'll often hear about, you'll talk to Madeline Eisberg on tombstones. If you want to show a concept, especially of an Eshet Chayil or someone who is a person who is deeply ingrained and connected to their Jewish identity, you'll put a pair of Shabbos candles on the tombstone often. That's not a common thing that you may see through Jewish cemeteries. Fascinatingly, this is one of the things that often get kept, and we've mentioned this, through generations, even when every other shred of Judaism is taken away. We talked about the people in Central and South America who had escaped from Europe in the times of the Spanish Inquisition, and they were required to relinquish their Jewish identity, and they did whatever small little piece of Jewish things they would do in secret. And there are these stories about how generations later you have these non-Jewish families in all sorts of Central American countries that, you know, were totally integrated into the non-Jewish society, and for whatever reason, and they had no idea why, they would go up into their attic and light 2 candles every Friday night. They would light 2 candles every Friday night. And it was only when researchers came through and asked, why do you do this? And they said, we have no idea. And they realized it was because they were descendants of hidden Jews from the 14 and 1500s that had to hide their Judaism and be outwardly non-Jewish. Let's just see here. They only thing they kept was lighting candles on Friday night. And they did it in the attic so nobody would see. And this was passed from generation to generation, even after the families had totally assimilated and sort of left as part of that family connection because of the deep, they said, we can't keep anything else that's Jewish, but this we'll try and still do, the concept of lighting Shabbos candles. And Sue asked in the chat that so often it would be an image of Shabbos candles they would put on the matzeva, like picture, like they would chisel it in. There'd be like a picture, sometimes a dove, sometimes Kohanim with the fingers, and for women it would often be Jew. Yes, Miriam, I'm going to unmute you. Let's see if this works. I would love to hear your question. Let's see. Ask to unmute. There you go, Miriam. What's your question? Go ahead.
Before we go any further, and I don't mean to interrupt you,
No
you
problem.
please set me as to when Shabbat candles were decided to be lit. Was it as late as the Shulchan Aruch? Was it earlier in the rabbinic era? When? Because there's nothing in the Chumash or Bible about Shabbat candles.
Great question.
So when exactly? So I'll know in my own head. exactly is there a decree to light Shabbat candles?
Phenomenal question, and that's what actually, well, let's start with that in that regard. Let's start with that. Great question. Because it actually comes from a verse in Isaiah.
Oh, that's early.
Yeah. Let's take a look. Yeah. Isaiah 58:13. And again, hopefully the screen sharing is working. If you see it here. This actually, this line in this verse in Isaiah is in many of the versions of Shabbat morning Kiddush. This verse in Isaiah is inserted, and some people actually use it as they say Shabbat morning Kiddush. This verse, in Tashivni Shabbat Raglecha, Asod Chafatzecha B'Yom Kodshi, V'karata L'Shabbat Oneg. This is one of these verses that every single word is laden with tremendous meaning. So it says, if you restrain your foot because of the Sabbath, from performing your affairs on my holy day, and you call the Sabbath a delight, and you honor it by not pursuing your favorite, then the next verse says, Ad titanagad Lashem, you're going to reap these wonderful rewards of connection to God. But this is the if. So the verse in Isaiah 58:13, and again, I'm looking this way because that's where my screen is. I apologize. It says one of the things is it's teaching you not just about the details of the rules of Shabbat. We find that from the pasuk in Sefer Shemot. But here we say, what is the feel, the spirit of the law of what Shabbat is supposed to mean to you? And it says, well, number one, it's a change of your schedule. Your affairs are different affairs when they're dealt with on Shabbat. You don't perform secular affairs, so to speak. Your Shabbat meal, so to speak, when you sit and you have a Shabbat gathering, your conversation, your aura should be elevated. That's the idea. And Vikarata l'Shabbat oneg. The word oneg you've probably heard. And we're going to translate it as pleasure or delight. That's the translation we have right here. Right? You shall call the Sabbath a delight. Likdosh Hashem michubat. That it is the holy day of the Lord which is honored. And how do you honor it? By not doing your wanted ways, meaning your you have other stuff that you don't do. You don't pursue your affairs. Speaking words. By the way, when it says speaking words, it refers to planning for non-Shabbat related activities. And that's based on that concept of daber davar. But let's note the two underlined words here. Two underlined words here are delight and honor. Or I'm going to, here in the Hebrew, oneg and the word kavod. Kavod and oneg. Take a look at the Midrash Tanchuma, very early source. Early part of the Tannaitic period, and says, from where do we see that one must light a candle on the Sabbath? As it says, Vikarata l'Shabbat oneg. Zo hadlakat haner. The source of lighting Shabbos candles is this concept of hadlakat haner. By the way, there's an entire chapter in Tractate Shabbat, the second chapter, which is part of the liturgy on Friday night tefillah, called Bameh Madlikin, which is the second chapter in the Masechet Shabbat, which is all about the laws of lighting Shabbos candles. So to your point, Miriam, it is very early. It's a really great question you asked about what the history is. It's very early with ascriptions to things all the way in the biblical era of the concept of lighting Shabbos candles. And in fact, there is a different midrash, which I don't quote here, that also connects it to the time of the Jews in the desert, the lighting of Shabbat candles. So it's a really early kind of thing. And the idea is that this is meant to be one of the ways in which we offer honor and create an aura of oneg. And I'm just going to use the Hebrew word from going on forward on Shabbat. Take a look at the book of Maimonides' book about the laws. It says, Arba'at Dvarim Ne'emru b'Shabbat. In the very beginning of his laws regarding how to observe Shabbat in positive ways. Shnayim in Torah, 2 are written in the Bible itself. Ushnayim in Divrei Sofrim, and 2 are written in the books of the prophets. That the prophets, i.e. Isaiah, elucidated. Sheba Torah, when the Torah tells us how we're supposed to observe Shabbos, it says Zachor and Shamor, which means remember Shabbat, and Shamor, guard Shabbat. Remember is the positive commandments of the way that we honor, that we conduct ourselves on Shabbat. And Shamor is the idea of guarding Shabbat, means avoiding the prohibited activities. What about these elucidated on the by the prophets? That's kavod and oneg, which means the idea of honor and, as we said, oneg, delight. Okay. So the concept of Shabbat candles. Let me just see if we have anybody in the waiting room. The concept of Shabbat candles comes from this very early concept of this is the way that we honor Shabbat. This is the way that we create an aura of Shabbat. And we'll differentiate those in a moment. But yes, Miriam, you have a question. Go ahead. Let me just, you need to unmute. Miriam, yeah, we can go, but you need to unmute yourself. I know you're raising your hand. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I don't mean to take up your time, and I don't mean to be difficult.
No problem.
Okay, but for me, just because it says v'karata Shabbat oneg, I don't see that's such a stretch where it says you should light candles.
Great
To me, it doesn't even hint that you do this by lighting 2 candles or more. It doesn't say anywhere, and I'm looking, that you should light candles on Shabbat. It does say you call it a delight, and if the rabbis wanted to interpret delight, meaning you light the candles, well, then that was their view, and we have followed it, hopefully, for many millennia to come.
That's exactly the case.
But where does it say candles anywhere?
Oh, no.
It's merely an indication.
That's right. That's but you presented it that right.
The light of the way that in order for us to understand that Shabbos means something to us, it lights the way to knowledge. You don't see anything in the dark.
Yeah.
So how do you find the light? You find it with a candle, because in those days they had nothing but candles.
Right. That's actually, it's really interesting that you bring this. And the point, Miriam, you're making is correct, that this is definitely a dirasha, which means an interpretive element, where the Torah has given us an ambiguous phrase called oneg and kavod. And it was the way in which the rabbis interpreted that pasuk, saying, what's the way that we're going to create a path for millennia, as you mentioned, that really has gone beyond just a technical law, that we're going to fulfill this concept of oneg and kavod, and and it came from that. So it's not that the words of the pasuk mean candles. Nobody's translating kavod as candles. It's kavod as honor, oneg as delight, and the key here is that the notion of what the rabbis, the way in which we fulfill oneg, is the concept of the candles. In the same way, by the way, when the Torah said Zachor, remember Shabbat, the way we fulfill that is reciting Kiddush. Nowhere does it say the word make Kiddush, but the way we fulfill that is through that practice. So it is the rabbi's interpretive power that has led us to fulfill this concept of oneg in this particular way. So it's exactly as you said, and that was the rabbi's understanding that led to this practice of the lighting of Shabbat candles.
Now, there is another thing there, and that is the use of 2 candles, not just 1.
Right, and there have been minhagim, or in my house, 10 candles.
The reason that we use 2 candles is one to light the other. In other words, you must show that there is another understanding of the fact that one person may know something, but it means much more when they share that understanding. So that is why we use two
Yeah,
rather than a single candle.
yeah, yeah. No, there's lots of different ideas about the numbers of candles, and lots of minhagim and lots of interpretation over the years, exactly for the point that you're making. I see David has his hand raised. Happy to hear you.
Hi, Rabbi. Thanks. I was just thinking as you were speaking, um, how the words in English relate to the Hebrew. When you say oneg is delight, and the word delight is like of light. I mean, delight.
Fascinating,
And
fascinating.
and also when when we were just sharing, they said spreading the light, like literally, like from person to person or candle to candle. It's like spread the light, spread the enlightenment or the wisdom. In English, we use the light to symbolize a lot of these concepts that I think are wanted for us to that we're talking about, even though it's based in Hebrew. It's interesting that it does connect so well.
Yeah, no,
And
it's there is actually a book. I believe it's called The Word, which traces a lot of contemporary words to all sorts of different Hebrew origins. I think like the word window, they found this somehow is connected to different Hebrew words. So yeah,
really,
no, yeah, there's a lot to that. That's a really
I'd
interesting
love
thing.
to see the book. What's it called? Or
Yeah,
do
it's
you,
called The Word.
the word? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Also,
Oh, sorry. Yes, I think you got muted again. I apologize.
oh, I'm just wondering if the word they said for oneg, I heard would be related. I heard something like reverse of nega, which is like we're in a bad period now, or of
Yeah,
disease. But I wondered also of noga, which is like one of
warm,
those inner
light. Yeah.
lights.
Yeah,
So I
I think
thought,
that's with an iron, so a little bit of a different spelling.
I
But
know, but I stretch it because I like
okay, okay, sounds good. Sounds
it.
good. Okay. Um, all right. So I want to. So the question is that's been raised by many different commentaries over the generations is what's the difference between kavod and oneg? Now, kavod, honor, is something that you generally do, and an action you do for someone else. Oneg is an aura you create for yourself, right? I am honoring the Shabbat, but I myself am having an oneg Shabbat. I'm having enjoyment. And you could see candles in both of those lights, so to speak, no pun intended or pun intended. Meaning, you could say that the way in which you give honor to Shabbat is that you light candles to that, you light candles that, um, adorn and beautify the room, right? If you have a candlelit dinner, right, it's very romantic. It's very meant to have a beautiful aura. The other hand, oneg is in terms of my joy. And by the way, there's a deep connection up to the concept of shalom bayit, um, of harmony in the home that's connected to Shabbos candles. And part of that has to do with the notion of oneg being, I can see people, right? That's what Ben mentioned. People can't see without electricity in the day. That's all they had was candles. So the idea is that I'm creating a more positive and friendly and connected environment when I have light in the home. So oneg refers to the type of environment I enjoy, but it's about me or about my family, about what the aura we do for humans. And kavod is about how we honor Shabbat. Now, interestingly, the commentaries refer, and this is the Gavil Nagon, refers to it in a little bit of a similar vein, although he phrases it differently. He talks about the Lashon Rambam, the words of the Rambam are, he mentions what we just said before, two things from the Torah, two things from the rabbis that were elucidated through the prophets. And he describes a zehu kavod. What does kavod mean? Sheyimna adam mincha ulamala milikvoa suuda. The concept of kavod is, listen to this, you don't have a big meal immediately prior to Shabbat. Why? Because if you have a big meal prior to Shabbat, how much appetite will you have at the official Shabbat meal? And the Vilna Gaon explains in a sort of a deeper way. He says, oneg, your joy, that refers to things that happen on Shabbat. Kavod, honor, refers to things you do in preparation for Shabbat. Right? When I honor something, it means that I set something up and I set the stage, set the table, so to speak, so that it will be beautiful. So the honor is actually what you do. The way you honor Shabbat is by preparing for it ahead of time. And so when the Torah said in the Navi, in the book of Isaiah, honor Shabbat, that's referring to all the things that you do ahead of time, like lighting the candles, perhaps, to prepare for Shabbat. Oneg refers to the actions that you do on Shabbat, which is the enjoyment that you have, the light you have. So it's interesting, what exactly are the candles for? Are the candles lit ahead of time because that's the way you honor Shabbat? Or are the candles lit ahead of time because you want to have the aura of oneg, the aura of enjoyment, or delight on Shabbat? And just because of the laws, you can't light it on Shabbat, so you light it early. So this has a bunch to do with the brachot, but this issue of Shabbat candles ended up being a fascinating family history, part of a family history. So again, the first part of our talk, we've just spent time background of Shabbat candles. We mentioned a couple of reasons why actually there may be two, and the source. The source is this concept of kavod and oneg. Oneg being something that you do on Shabbat, kavod something you do ahead of time. Now, keep that in your back or front pocket, and let's explore a fascinating historical figure. And it's the family named Falk, F-A-L-K, the Falk family. Now, Falk was actually a fairly common name in a variety of Eastern and Western European countries. And it has a really interesting history, just of Falk. There are those who talk about it's having to do with a falcon. Why? So this is a really interesting, interesting background. So if you remember, if you know, let's stop the share for a second. If you're familiar with Yiddish, you often have certain phrases of other languages, usually German or Yiddish, connected with a name. For example, Tzvi Hirsch, right? Or Aryeh Leib. Leib meaning lion, Aryeh Leib, Tzvi Hirsch, right? So somebody named Heshi or Hershey, often their actual name is Tzvi, because there's that connection between between the Hebrew and the the Hebrew and the other language. So you often have, when someone is named Yehoshua, the name will be connected with Falk, F-A-L-K. And what's interesting is because, by the way, it was often that they would have two names. You would have a Hebrew first name and a German second name. And by the way, they would often also have a patronymic or a family name, like a last name. So HaKohen or Ben something would be very common. So again, Tzvi would be Hirsch. By the way, Zev Wolf. Zev is the Hebrew word for wolf. And so the German word for wolf was Wolf. So you'd have Zev Wolf. So, by the way, sometimes you would be Wallach or Valak or Falk. And some of it has to do with falcon. Why falcon? Because a falcon circles its prey before it strikes. So too, a Yehoshua circled the land of Israel before he started the settling of the land. So that's how some connected to Falk. Others say that V-A-L-K, or Falk, has some connection to a acronym or as they call it, kvetching, a putting together of the words ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So some say that that's the connection of Falk, but it generally was it was not usually used as a last name. So usually, for example, Rabbi Yehoshua Falk that we're going to talk about lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and he was actually last name, he was a Cohen, so it was Rabbi Yehoshua Falk HaKohen or Rabbi Yehoshua Falk Katz. Katz was a very common Kohen name because it's the Chaf Tzadi Kohen Tzedek. So Katz was a very common Kohen name. But that was his Rabbi Yehoshua Falk. He was a Polish Jew, and he was a great sage. And one of the interesting things he believed in was, and this is, I think, so beautiful that Miriam read your comment before, he believed in not relying only on secondary sources, studying the original sources, the original code, the original psukim. So his main work of writing was on the earlier sources, like Rabbeinu Asher, Yaakov ben Asher's Tur, and he wrote many commentaries on that. Now, what's fascinating, that we'll talk a little bit about, is all of his writings and specifically his family history. So Rabbi Yehoshua Falk, or Rabbi Yehoshua HaKohen Falk, was a leader in something called the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot, the Council of the Four Lands. Now, the Council of the Four Lands was basically from 1555 to 1764. And it was this really interesting, very unique time in really Polish, but that whole greater area's Jewish history, which is it was called a Sejm, S-E-J-M in Polish, or a General Congress. And basically what happened was there was a huge Jewish community in Poland. And it was so integrated into the Polish industrial economy that the Jews of Poland basically were given somewhat by the Polish authorities, essentially somewhat level of autonomy in their own communal interests. They were able to have administration over like religious areas, their own charitable institutions, but they basically were given some, with the imprimatur of the Polish authorities, some level of self-government, having their own judicial system, and they supervised, and they did this by creating a Congress. And the Congress was called the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot. And this Congress had like minutes and and records of it. It was really fascinating. And only in 1764 did the Parliament of Poland disband the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot. Why? Because the main reason the Polish authorities allowed this to exist is because they were really good at tax collection. They were given this autonomy on the assumption that they would collect taxes from the Jewish populace to give to the secular authorities, and they did it a great job. So there were delegates from all over these four main lands, Greater Poland, Little Poland, Galicia, and different parts of from the east, and they they actually were tax collectors on behalf of the secular government. When in the late 1700s, there were lots of scandals and this and that, but in the late 1700s, what ended up happening was that taxes started drying up. And so the Polish parliament dissolved the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot. But basically, the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot had up between, a quorum was a small number of delegates, but it was 25 delegates from all over. And they had also 6 leading rabbis. And they had this general delegation of the council. And sometimes, by the way, the main disputes of the day were played out in the meetings of the Vad Arba Ha'aratzot. So this this land, this council was a very, very powerful and really interesting time in Jewish history because it gave Jewish freedom of autonomy in a very really interesting way. What it also gave was a forum for the resolution of a variety of fascinating disputes. One of those disputes was what's called the Get of Vienna. The Get of Vienna was in 1611, and it was the first main foray into big public life of Rabbi Yoshua Falk, otherwise known, as we'll see, as the Prisha. So in 1611, there was a young boy. They got married very young those days. A young boy of 16 and a half, 17, who was married off to a young girl. I guess they got married early. He got married at 16 and a half, 17, and she was a similar age. His name was Yitzchak Wolfish. That was his name. And his wife was named Batsheva. And Yitzchak Wolfish got, I believe it was typhus. He got some very, very serious illness. They had just been married. Obviously, they didn't have any children. And this young boy, his family decided that they didn't want to get to the concern of what's called Yibum and Chalitza, right? They didn't want to have a concern of Yibum and Chalitza. So what did they do? They decided to have Yitzchak Wolfish give his wife a get, give his wife a bill of divorce, so that if he didn't survive his illness, she would be divorced as opposed to being a widow. There are a variety of different reasons why they wanted her to be a divorcee and not a widow. Okay, so he gives this get, but the assumption that everybody agreed on was that if he doesn't die and he gets better, he'll just marry her right back. She'll go back and get married, no problem. And Baruch Hashem, miracle of miracles, he actually recovered. He recovered, and this procedure was overseen by our protagonist, Rabbi Yoshua Falk, or Rabbi Yeshua Katz. However, after this boy got better, there ended up being a fight between the two families. And the fight was that the family of this girl Batsheva, didn't want to let her get married back to him. They didn't want to let her get married back to him. They didn't like him. They thought that he wasn't a good guy. I don't know. They didn't like the family. They had some fight. And so they wouldn't allow her to go get married to the man she was married to. She was already married to him. He had given her a get on the condition that if he gets better, they'll just get right back married again. And here's the interesting thing is, he had given her a dowry, including his home. So the home was in her name. This guy, so he's now gotten better, left the hospital or whatever way, but he doesn't have a home to get back to because the home is in her name, and she's not willing, or the family's not willing to have her get married back to him.
Rabbi Posy, wasn't a dowry usually from a woman to a man?
This was a gift from the man's family to the woman. The man's family.
It's
to
unusual.
The woman. Yeah, This is what they did. Yeah. So they went to Rabbi Falkatz and said, "What do we do?" They went to a third rabbi, the Maharam of Lublin, Rabbi Meir of Lublin. They went to Rabbi Meir of Lublin, who said this divorce was conditional, and the condition didn't get fulfilled. So they're still married from the first place. He said that that since that they're not willing to fulfill the condition, then they did a condition that wasn't fulfilled. So so the woman is still married, and as if she doesn't have to get back married, they're married in the first place. So this became a huge, huge debate. and they convened a meeting of the Vad Arba Haratzot, of this council of the four lands, to discuss this issue, because it became what I call a cause celeb, similar to the Get of Cleves. A cause celeb in this, in the whole Polish community of what the story is, where some people said this way, some people said that way, and right in the center of this was the Rabbi Yoshua Falk of Lemberg, which is where he lived. Now, during this time, it became a time of tremendous angst, and it took a toll on many of the participants. Obviously, the family that was dealing with this, but obviously also the family. This is now a massive controversy, and it became essentially a national story of the entire Jewish community over the entire Polish, the Polish Jewish nation, and they wanted to figure out what to do. And the rabbis who were involved write about how this took a toll on them personally. Now, Rabbi Yoshua Falk, who we talked about, who wrote all these books about the original sources, really was at the forefront of this firestorm, and it took a tremendous personal toll on him. And so what happened? You know who he would advise and learn from and write from and understand from? His wife Bela. Because during the time where he was in the middle of this massive controversy, where everybody was arguing about him, he took solace and talked it through with his wife, who was herself a great sage. Now, if you'll think about the 1700s, you didn't see that many books being written by women about all sorts of different halachic topics. But he recognized that he wasn't in this alone. And while he wrote most of his books, quotes and talked through many of the decisions that you'll see that he writes in his halachic response in his work, he writes as from his wife. And so this is where it gets really interesting. His son, after he died, Rabbi Falk died, his son published his works and wrote, and I'm going to see if I can find it here, wrote a introduction to the book that was published of his works. And his son wrote essentially saying, my dad wrote lots of great books, but you know who really had the great ideas? My mom. And he writes about the great piety and great scholarship of his mother. And I'm going to see if I can find here. Here, let's see. I'm gonna quote here. Let's see. Here we go. So this is the text, and it's in Hebrew, but I'll translate from English. Give me just a moment, please. The text of the son of this Rabbi Falk, where he describes about his mom. And here, let's see here. Let's share the screen here. Screen number 4. Okay. So he talks about how his mother, Bela, weighed in on the issue that we talked about. He says, Afsha kavana mefursemet. Says, even though the commonly known explanation of Shtei Nerot Shabbat U'Keneged Zachor v'Shamor is regarding the concept of Zachor and Shamor. That's why you have 2 candles, or some of the reasons that Ben said. Gam b'Yom Tov madlikim Shtei Nerot. We also light candles on Yom Tov. Okay? So some say, why? Shtei Nerot Keneged Ha'ish v'Ha'isha, man and woman. Or 2 Nerot is the same gematria of the limbs of man and woman. Or the concept of having these of the connected to people aliyahs. Okay, but here he says ha'arot rabbanit hasma. Sma, Sefer Meirot Yerushalayim, was the book written by Rabbi Falk. And so it says that there was Dvarim B'Shem HaRabbanit Bela, an issue about this topic by the Rabbanit, the Rebbitzin, Bela, who discussed this. And he dealt with, and let's see, let me find he said that his mother noted that there were certain mistakes that were common in what people did, that his mother said, and this is the second one, Masha noagot anashim ladlik nerotem shel yom tov achar sheitpalalu hakahal arvit. Says that sometimes he said, this was his mother's opinion, that it wasn't right that women would light their Yom Tov candles very late. He says they should light their candles before Yom Tov starts. That he says because the reason is because this is part of Kavod Shabbat. His mother felt that the reason for lighting Shabbos candles and Yom Tov candles is part of kavod, is part of honoring Shabbat. And the way you honor something is that you prepare for it ahead of time. Remember the sources that we did. So if honoring something is preparing for it ahead of time, it's better to light candles before Yom Tov. Now, of course, you light candles before Shabbat because you're not allowed to light on Shabbat. But in theory, you are allowed to light from an existing flame on Yom Tov. So some people would say, okay, we're going to light it on Yom Tov. That would be reflecting the concept of oneg, which is something you do on the day. But Mrs. Prisha, Mrs. Sma, Mrs. Falk held that it was appropriate to light Yom Tov candles early because it's expressing kavod. And so he writes, Vishamati mimena hata'amim. And this is the reasons, and the analysis is what I heard from my mother. And so the entire halacha and the writing of all the rules of Shabbat candles came from Mrs. Prisha. And the background is the following, is that when there was this terrible controversy between, and a political turmoil between all sorts of different factions, which is something that we are familiar with in every generation, he says, where could I find my solace? Where do I find my, my connection? That's in my family. When you find connection in your family, he says, I realized that I need to draw upon my family in all of my work. So basically, the work that he wrote, that essentially is one of the main commentaries on halacha that has been used for every generation, he wrote together with his wife. And it was her reasons that ended up impacting many of the halachot that he followed, that he poskined. So it's interesting. Shabbos candles have a lot to do with kavod, with shalom bayis. But here it's actually an added element where the whole idea of what's supposed to be going on is connected to the notion of, again, the candles being that example of halacha that was learned from a family. And it was somebody who realized that his entire family allowed him to have, so he was in the public sphere, but their family was really what was underlying all of the rules and the regulation that he did. And I think especially poignant on this halacha, it's a very inspiring thing, knowing his story, that it's not just him, but he actually wrote these things together with his wife and had her quoted in the laws as he followed them based on his respect and agreement of her scholarship just as equal to his. So when she had something to say, he inserted it in the book also. And that was a really interesting thing. So it's a practical halacha having to do with Shabbos candles, but I think what's even more interesting is the family story and the authorship of this particular halacha having to do with the laws of Shabbat and Yom Tov candles.
Rabbi Posy,
yes, go ahead, Sue.
I think that that's important, particularly now when we really are spending time inside with the family.
Yes, absolutely, to realize what the privilege that is, but also what an opportunity it is to be really connected to family. I just want to end really quick. First of all, if you haven't filled out the census, you count. Please make sure you do so. Today's the last day. But also a reminder that 8 p.m. on this channel, we have our second series from Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, who is a phenomenal teacher. It starts tonight at 8 p.m. on this channel if you're able to join. And it's so great to be back together with everybody. Wish everybody a wonderful, great week. A Shabbat Shalom. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other again soon.
Shabbat shalom.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?